Positive EV betting is all about understanding when we have odds we can place bets at that are better than the true odds of that event occurring. Now, there's more than one way to get at what those true odds are. This video is going to tell you all about it. Stay tuned. Welcome to Data-Driven Sports Betting. I'm A-Train Bets, and I use my brain to make bets. Now, this video, we're going to dive a little deep because we are going to look into multiple de-vigging options. Now, de-vigging is a scary word that really is a pretty straightforward concept that everything in positive EV betting is based upon. So if you don't understand de-vigging, you're in the right spot. So what de-vigging is, sportsbooks exist because they offer odds at prices where they get this little bit in between that is their hold. So a typical football bet, for example, is going to be offered at minus 110 American odds on either side. Right. So what that means is you're going to bet $11 to win $10. And on the other side of the bet, the other person's going to bet $11 to win $10. And what's going to end up happening is one of those sides is going to win. Sometimes they push and then everybody gets their money back, but one of the sides is typically going to win, and the winners are going to get their $11 back plus the $10 that they won. The losers get bupkis, and the book gets $1. So that is where the books make their money. So as long as they have odds that generally reflect, or lines that generally reflect the likelihood of an event occurring on either side, they're going to be okay. Because whatever side that happens, as long as they can get even money on either side, they're going to be able to take their hold and profit. That's how sportsbook, that's the fundamental business model of sportsbooks. Okay. As sports bettors, our job is to pick which side is more likely to occur than what the odds are saying. We win money because we're winning more than we're losing, right? So that's the game. That is the game. Us as sports bettors get to choose. Sportsbooks offer both sides, but get to take a cut. That's the model. So our job as positive EV bettors. So positive EV betting, if you're not familiar, there's a bunch of videos that I have on the subject, a lot of resources out in the world. That is where we are looking at the data and the odds in the market being the collection of all the sports books in the world, to try to figure out where are these opportunities where we should pick a bet, one versus another, pick a bet where there's positive expected value. And then the way we determine that is that the odds that we can actually place the bet at are better than what we determine the true odds of the event occurring are. So we have to determine what is that true odds, or the no-vig odds. We call it the no-vig line at A-Train Station. So that's the goal. Well, the way we do that is we take all of these odds, but all these odds are just different sides of things. We have to figure out, okay, where do we draw that middle line? This is where it gets interesting because there's more than one way to do that. There's actually a bunch of different ways to do that. And when we look at different scenarios, some ways will tend to be better than others. And what we do at A-Train Station a lot of the time is we're going to use the worst case scenario. So we look at a few different methods and we say, you know what? I want to find the plays first and foremost are the ones that I look at all the different methods and still find positive expected value, where I can still say, no matter which method I use to try to find those fair odds, this still looks like a good bet. That's great, right? That's exactly what you want to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at an example of a scenario where there's multiple different calculations that we would have based on the different de-vigging options, and explain why it may be useful in this context to look at it through these different lenses. And that's really what de-vigging is all about. It's about saying, how can we cast a different perspective on what truth might be? There's no answer key to truth. We don't know exactly what the true fair odds are, so we're estimating things. This is why we want to be using a scenario where we look at it a few different ways and we say, well, based on every way we're looking at it, this still looks like a great bet. Those are the bets you want to play, right? So that's why, even though like this video is detailing some of the reasons and the specifics behind the de-vigging methodologies, it's actually the most important is to know that there's multiple different ways to look at it, and we want the bets that overcome them all. That's why we advocate for the worst case de-vigging, especially until you understand some of the nuance between them. Being able to understand why we are doing this, I think, is really crucial. But the key takeaway is just be conservative and look for those opportunities where the stars align and everything is pointing in that right direction. The more different points of view you have and they're all pointing and aligned in the same thing, like go make the bet, those are bets you want to make. If you see a lot of conflicting information, maybe step back or bet less. Those are the kinds of things as a sharp sports bettor, you can realize. This is why we talk about sports betting like a poker game. In a poker game, sometimes you value bet. You dabble at a pot or something like that. You're like, I might have the best hand here. I'm going to play a little bit, but I'm going to be cautious. We do that in sports betting as well. I think I have a read, but I'm not highly confident in it. I'm going to reduce my bet size. On the ones where I see all of the things align and I'm like, this is a great play from every conceivable angle, I'm going to bet more. That's exactly how you do it. You don't want to overbet your bankroll. You don't want to put too much at risk, but you definitely want to get the money in when you have the best of it. Multiple de-vigging methodologies help you get the money in when you have the best of it. And that's really key. So let's look at this example. This is Oakland Athletics and Texas Rangers. All right. So just to orient you to what's going on here, this is an Adolis Garcia home runs over, and we have Pinnacle, which is the sharpest book in general, not usually quite as sharp on the player props, but in this case, we're feeling pretty good about the read. What we see here is at FanDuel, you see plus 250 on the over. They're only offering one side on this line, but that plus 250, that's an offset bet with BetMGM and PointsBet. So we can say, okay, we would bet both sides and get our money back. So we know there's some value here. We can easily perceive value based on the analysis in here. You see a little bit of market movement and things like that. But like the fact is, plus 250, big outlier line, looks really good compared to anybody else in the market. If you believe Adolis Garcia is going to hit a home run, this is where you want to play it. That's objectively true. And we could say based on the data here, there's a pretty good argument to be made that you should play this. So even with worst case scenario de-vigging, we have an 8% play here, 8.47%. So what this means is that we use multiple different de-vigging methodologies, and at the end of them all, we are still going to make this play at plus 250, and it's an 8% play. But if we were using other de-vigging methodologies, we would have, in this case, even higher expected value percentages. So, and that's going to always be true of worst case. It's always going to be at as good or better for other lesser de-vigging methodologies based on any read. That's what gives us that level of confidence. All right, so what we're going to start with is actually, though we have worst case, I actually want to start with this X. This X represents multiplicative de-vigging. Multiplicative de-vigging is effectively providing the estimate of the hold. So we can see the hold. We don't know what FanDuel's hold is per se, but we see holds at different books that are offering different amounts. FanDuel has some sort of calculation, but we could assume that the hold is being allocated across the gamut of different likelihoods of outcomes equivalently. So the VIG is spread proportionately across all of those different outcomes. And that is where when there's a more likely scenario, like a favorite, it is going to get a higher amount of the VIG, right? The problem with that is that, and this is just, multiplicative, first and foremost, is the standard, quote unquote, standard way of de-vigging. If there's a sports betting platform or tool out there that isn't talking about de-vigging, they're probably just using multiplicative. It's the generally accepted standard way of de-vigging. The rub, though, is, have you ever seen odds on a big underdog, and those odds are nowhere near as good as the real likelihood of that event occurring? Like, it's one of those things where it's, you see crazy unlikely scenario. If you look at a race, all these people in a Formula One race have no chance of winning. You know how Formula One is set up. There's no chance for half that field to win this race. Zero chance. But it's not exactly zero. It's just really close to zero. But they'll give them, 100 to 1 odds. It'll be plus 10,000 or something like that. And that seems really high. But the reality is that that's not a very good number. The reality is the true odds are actually way worse. It should be like plus 200,000 instead of plus 10,000. If you've seen those scenarios, you'll understand fundamentally what the long shot favorite bias is. What that means is that books tend to diminish the payouts on underdogs because people want to get those payouts, right? You're like, well, plus 10,000, I'm definitely going to do that because it's a 99%. I got to risk way too much money for making almost nothing on this favorite. That's what people think about, right? Multiplicative doesn't account for any of that. They just assume, all these odds are going to be offered at a fair amount. Well, no. That's not exactly how it works at all. It's actually going to be very much skewed. So the problem is with multiplicative is that is going to make the underdogs seem much better. What do we see here? X means multiplicative. Our little icon here. That's a 16% play. Well, we were already looking at it. It was an 8% play here when we were using worst case. Multiplicative makes it look like it's double that. So the underdog makes it look so much better. This is why if you don't do worst case, your underdog plays are going to look really good. What's really scary too, look how much it's recommending me play based on the Kelly criteria calculation. It's saying I should play $265 on this on a big underdog. But if I was using worst case, it's about half of that is the recommended bet size. This is why the EV percentage is so important to your bet sizing, right? So if I'm using multiplicative, I'm using a one-dimensional strategy for my de-vigging, this underdog looks way better than it should. But the reality is that there's more vig implied at higher underdogs. So the reality is that we shouldn't be doing it just this way, especially for big underdogs. If it was a favorite and we're using the multiplicative, well, then it's more likely going to be a conservative estimate because it isn't correcting for the long shot favorite bias. So it's putting more of that vig on the favorites, which means if we're overcoming that based on our market read, then we have a real opportunity there. So on favorites, multiplicative is going to tend to be the worst case scenario. On underdogs, the logarithmic is actually going to be that. So if you hear logarithmic, which is this little caret here, or it's also called power, some will call it power or logarithmic, it means the same thing. What that does is it actively corrects for this. And you can learn about all the calculation stuff. That's too deep for this particular video, but those calculations, you can understand the logarithmic corrects for that and actually kind of overshoots it to the other side, where it underrepresents the value of underdogs and overstates the relative value of favorites. That's problematic on the other side, right? So we cast this range. What's really interesting is this range between the two. So like you can see here, this is a pretty significant underdog, plus 250, and the favorite side is at minus 250. So you're talking a pretty big underdog and favorite bias, but not super crazy, not like a 90% thing. But here we have a situation where this corrects for this, but it's going to overstate the value of these. So if my EV calculation, where these guys were jumping over here, you would see the further distance to logarithmic, because it's where we get EV is when the line on this side jumps over to the other side. So that's why this plus 250, we're drawing it back to this logarithmic. That's where the value is. If one of these had a price that was jumped over here, going against the logarithmic would be bigger than what it would be going against the multiplicative. So the logarithmic is going to make favorites look way better and the underdogs look way worse. Right. So that's how logarithmic changes that. Now the math you can go and research, like I said, but it's one more perspective that is designed to solve for that favorite long shot bias. There's an additional, actually 3 different methodologies that kind of cast it somewhere in between. There's other problems with this though. So this plus represents additive, and additive is where they've basically said, what's that middle point based on probabilities between these two, which is a very simplistic type of thing, but it will typically fall in the middle of these other two that control for those biases. This doesn't control for anything, but it tends to be less accurate where in the middle. And so it ends up being in the middle ground, but on finer tuned things, it's less reliable. So there's a couple different ways of calculating what is called an additive or core additive de-vigging methodology. There's additive, and then there's probit, which is just a slight variation on that. I kind of think of it as the difference between a meter and a yard. They're both about 3 feet. They're just slightly different. And they're both about 100 centimeters. They're just slightly different. It's kind of like that. It's about the same measure, but it's calculated slightly differently. You've got power, which is logarithmic, which is going to help overestimate the favorites, but underestimate the underdogs. You've got multiplicative, which is going to help overestimate the underdogs and underestimate the favorites. You've got additive / probit, which is going to be somewhere in between, which may be better in aggregate in some cases, but again, there's a reason people generally use multiplicative. It's probably the best in the middle range, which is where most of the bets occur, in that kind of -110, -110 range. That's why we use multiplicative. The problem is that for either underdogs or favorites, you're going to see this range widen because there's more error, because there's bigger underdogs and favorites. And that's where using both multiplicative and power/logarithmic help you control for that. So that's why, like, in the middle ground, you're probably better off using multiplicative, but at the end ranges, you're probably better off using a worst case. So that's really the lesson there. It gets complicated, but the other thing is there's one more. So it's actually called Shin. Shin is also designed to control for that favorite long shot bias, and also tries to control for the flip side that logarithmic causes. The thing is it's exactly the same as additive in a two-way market. So in a home runs over or under, Shin is exactly the same as additive. When we start to factor in multi-way betting, Shin can be very useful in controlling for that. And it kind of creates, it's an iterative calculation that helps us get to a kind of clear view. It's an interesting mathematical study that comes from not sports betting. All of these got developed, by the way, outside of sports betting and have been applied to sports betting. So sports betting benefits from the Kelly criteria is the same way. It was designed for something entirely different and has then been applied to sports betting. So similarly, these calculation methodologies of de-vigging have been applied mathematics to the sports betting space. They apply, but they weren't designed for this originally. They were designed in other contexts. Shin was especially designed for a scenario in which there are certain players in a market that have unique information. They actually know what the outcome is going to be. How do we treat those pieces of information in addition to less informed constituencies? And so that is how Shin kind of operates. Again, that's an estimate based on an estimate when it comes to sports betting, but it's a very interesting one because there's some obvious parallels around the availability of information and how good someone's read on a particular situation is. So if you can estimate how many knowledgeable players are there, Shin can be very useful. Regardless, on a two-way market, doesn't matter. So additive, probit, Shin, that's all that plus sign. They're all basically in that very range. There's no reason to graph them separately because they're so closely aligned, and actually additive and Shin are identical. So the long and short of it is, when we look at these different methodologies, again, this 11% kind of comes somewhere in the middle. But you wouldn't want to just use this in isolation either, because even though it might be a decent compromise in the aggregate in any given situation, it may not be what you really want to use. The key is that, like anything, de-vigging methodologies are one more piece of that data story. They're not the whole story. But that range, what I love about de-vigging and what I love a lot about the worst case method is that this gives us some understanding of the margin of error. It's not a perfect margin of error calculation, but it's certainly helpful when we're looking at big underdogs, because I can play an underdog with much more confidence now. Once we started implementing worst case de-vigging, I'm now playing underdogs in the plus 400 range from time to time. Very small bet sizing, but I see these opportunities out there because the line is mispriced at the median, and then as it extends out towards the underdogs, we're getting good value. So sometimes you see something like this where you know definitively in an offset bet situation, that plus 250 has to be a viable bet. It has to be a good bet. You won't see a market where there's an offset bet or an arbitrage when something isn't mispriced. Like, something has to be mispriced in this market. We can tell definitively that's the case because it implies a 0% hold in a market. That's not going to be how it works. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for these needles in a haystack. You know, A-Train Station is like the biggest magnet ever, just sucking up all the needles for you to look at. Which needles do you want to actually take action on? And that's the whole idea behind this, is that by calibrating, we can now compare big underdog plays to what we would see in a minus 110 range. And there may be more value on this kind of scenario where it's a home run. I mean, it's either going to happen or it's not. When you look at the math over time, there can be enough of these plays that this could be a profitable strategy that you could implement based on this kind of analysis using the worst case de-vigging. So it's a lot to think about, but I think the takeaway is really simple. It's look at the worst case, look at what's going on here, and just use it as one more point of data and then adjust accordingly. Adjust your bet sizing. Think about what the EV percentage is really telling you. Like we used to say on player props, I wouldn't bet less than 2%. Now I regularly go down to 1.5% using worst case de-vigging because I know that in these cases, we're controlling for that uncertainty. We see that visually. That's what A-Train Station does. It helps you see these things visually so you don't have to think about, okay, which one's which, whatever. I just know I'm drawing off of the worst case scenario. Let's go. If you don't have worst case de-vigging, then you don't know where that line is. You don't even know which methodology they're using. Do you want to bet into a situation where you don't know which methodology is controlling for which thing? So that's what you really want to be able to do. And that's where too, like when we look at our settings page, you can select which ones you want to use. Our default is to have them all selected and use worst case, because that's going to keep you as safe as possible. And when you find those plays, they're going to pop out. You're going to see them and you'll be like, ooh, this might even be better. Worst case is this is the worst scenario. We're still seeing EV. It might even be better than that. And that's the kind of approach you want to take when you're sports betting. There's so many estimates, so many gray pieces of information in that data story. You want to be able to say with confidence, wow, I see the whole story. And wow, that's a play I want to make. And that's how you want to get to those actions. You want to do it fast. Like we've taken a long time here trying to explain the nuances, the ins and outs, the different pieces of this chart. We didn't even get into the math. That's not really relevant. This is applied. This is about pragmatic. This is about saying, well, now that we're using worst case, we can go bet into the Adolis Garcia home runs with a pretty strong feeling like we have EV here. And that's really what it's all about. Right. So when you use A-Train Station, you can see these things visually. You can start to understand them. You can always go research more, but you can use it today. You can use it right now and say, wow, I have a lot more confidence betting into this plus 250 now that I can see the whole thing and know I'm going against the worst case scenario versus if I was betting into it at 16%, over betting my bankroll and trying to hit these long shots because this doesn't account for the fact that those are likely to be underpaid. So there's still value in underdogs. A lot of the time the value's in the underdogs because that's the side that's got the better price, right? Because you see that they have a different perspective on the market. Well, the underdog's still going to have some value, but you also know you have to overcome that hold that's going to be more allocated to the underdog a lot of the time because public bettors, non-sharp bettors also, they're going to want to bet a little to win a lot. That is a public dynamic. That is something that we have to always think about. Sharps will be more willing to play favorites, pay minus 180, pay $18 to win 10. That's what a sharp's going to do because a public bettor is typically not going to do that. They're going to be like, oh, well, they eyeball the chance. I think there's a decent chance this is going to happen. I'd rather win more. It's a short-sighted mentality. Granted, there's a lot of opportunities in underdogs, but using worst case is going to help you control on both sides, find wherever there's opportunities in that market using the worst case scenario. So that's what we highly recommend new bettors do. And that's why adding these kinds of features in, while it's good to know the details, like some of the things that we talked about in this video, the more important thing is, can you apply it in a way that helps you win money sports betting? And that's what we do with A-Train Station. We're always looking for ways to give you that little bit extra edge, that little bit sharper edge that you can go in to create the best bets possible. So with that, that's really what I wanted to cover in this. So hopefully you have a better understanding now of what de-vigging means, what it does, and why there's multiple different methodologies and what they control for. None of them are perfect. One perspective, can you ever see depth as well with one eye open versus two eyes open, right? You want to have more than one perspective so that you can see more deeply into what's happening on any given play. And that is what we advocate for at A-Train Station. We are always trying to find more ways to give you more points of view so that you can look at a fully illuminated situation and know what your action should be. That's the core to any kind of data-driven behavior. What's awesome is that using these kinds of techniques for sports betting is a lot of fun, but the beauty is you can take these techniques and apply them in many different contexts in your work and in your life to understand, hey, when I look at data and I can understand this data story, I can take better action and have a better result. That's true in sports betting and that's true in life. So with that, everybody, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you learned a few things, but for now, this train's leaving the station. Until next time, save the units for the bros and do your betting like pros. We'll see you on the next one.